everyone, it's your fellow true crime fanatic Jay, and I am back with yet another solved true crime case for you all. For this video, I will be discussing a controversial case. We are on case number 19, and I know a lot of you prefer unsolved cases instead of solved ones, but this case has been on my list of cases to cover for a while now, and I feel like this case isn't talked about a lot anymore. Based on the title of this video, I'm sure a lot of you guys recognize this person that I will be talking about. Maybe a lot of you are fans. I know I myself enjoy a few of his songs, and I was shocked when I found out what had happened to him. It's a crazy and very sad story. I will now put up my disclaimer for this video. This video will include topics of child abuse, alcoholism, drug addiction, suicide attempts, physical violence, and gun violence that will lead to a tragic murder. If you are new, don't forget to subscribe to support the channel and follow me on my social media platforms that I've linked down below in the description. Let's get started on this case. This is the murder of singer and Motown icon Marvin Gaye. Marvin Pence Gaye Jr. was born on April 2nd, 1939 in Washington, D.C. to his mother Alberta Gaye and father Marvin Pence Gaye Sr. To mainly avoid confusion, I will be referring to his father as MG Sr. Marvin was their second born child together. He had an older sister, Jean, a younger sister, Zeola, and a younger brother, Frankie. He also had two half-brothers, Michael, who was Alberta's son from a previous relationship, and Antoine, who was born through MG Sr.'s infidelity and was MG Sr.'s youngest child. MG Sr. forced Alberta to send her son Michael to live with her sister since MG Sr., quote, couldn't raise another man's son, end quote. Marvin and his siblings grew up in a public housing project called the Fairfax Apartments. As Marvin got older, he and his friends would nickname the area Simple City. It was a very old and poor neighborhood. Most of the buildings were very small, in need of desperate repairs, and lacked both electricity and running water. The neighborhood was also severely overcrowded, and alleyways were filled with 1- or 2-story shacks that people would live in. Marvin Gaye began showing interest in music from a very young age of 3 years old. MG Sr., who was a church minister, would take Marvin to church where he would sing. At 4 years old, he started to learn how to play piano. Alberta alleges that MG Sr. had always hated their son Marvin. She stated, quote, "My husband never wanted Marvin, and he never liked him. He used to say he didn't think he was really his child. I told him that was nonsense. He knew Marvin was his. But for some reason, he didn't love Marvin, and what's worse, he didn't want me to love Marvin either. Marvin wasn't very old before he understood that," end quote. MG Sr. was a very strict and religious man, and he ruled his household with an iron fist. MG Sr. and his family were part of a Pentecostal church known as the House of God. The House of God advocates a very strict set of rules that adhere to both the Old and New Testaments. MG Sr. believed in physical punishment and would often inflict brutal whippings upon his wife and children. He abused all 4 of his children that lived under his roof and would whip them for even the most ridiculous things, such as if they quoted a Bible verse wrong. MG Sr. was an extreme alcoholic and angry man. He was a womanizer and had multiple affairs behind Alberta's back. It was also a well-known fact that he enjoyed cross-dressing. His children would catch their father wearing their mother's clothes on multiple occasions. They didn't dare acknowledge this to MG Sr. in fear of getting beaten. Unfortunately, the neighborhood they lived in knew about MG Sr.'s cross-dressing habits, and let's remember, this was during the 1940s and 1950s. Cross-dressing wasn't acceptable, and as a result, Marvin and his siblings were targets of bullying, and Marvin became bitter and resentful at his father for this. The neighborhood kids would tease Marvin about his father's cross-dressing, and it really didn't help that their last name was Gaye either, in all honesty. Kids can be very cruel. They tease and taunt each other for anything and everything. So imagine yourself as a young black child in the 1940s and 50s. You live in a very poor neighborhood. Life is already hard enough, but add the fact that your alcoholic and abusive father is a cross-dresser and everyone around you knows about this. It must have been hell for his children to grow up in that environment. All of them had been physically hit and bruised by the hand of their father. But it became obvious very quickly that Marvin would receive the worst of the abuse. His older sister Jean has said that from the age of 7 through his teen years that Marvin's life was a series of brutal whippings. Marvin would later describe living in his father's house as, quote, living with a king, a very peculiar, changeable, cruel, and all-powerful king, end quote. He would suffer abuse from his father almost every single day. Marvin has even stated, quote, "By the time I was 12, there wasn't an inch of my body that hadn't been bruised and beaten by him," end quote. Marvin Gaye's only escape from the physical and emotional abuse was music, and he fell in love with singing. Marvin and his mother Alberta were very close despite MG Sr.'s efforts in preventing Alberta from comforting and coddling her son. She would still comfort and encourage his singing talent quietly without MG Sr. knowing. Marvin has stated multiple times throughout his life that without the support of his mother, he probably would have committed suicide as a child. Alberta was the main breadwinner of the family and worked as a domestic worker, while MG Sr. wasn't able to hold any job for very long. Ironically, MG Sr. had initially caused Marvin Gaye's love for music and was the person that introduced Marvin to singing at the church and then later coached his son how to play piano. In junior high, Marvin became a rising singing star in his junior high glee club and began taking his singing a lot more seriously. But the relationship with his father was deteriorating even more. He was still receiving constant whippings for the smallest infractions. If Marvin was 1 minute late coming home from school, he would be whipped. If Marvin had put the hairbrush back in the wrong place, he would be whipped. MG Sr. found excuses to whip and beat his own children, and around this time he would frequently kick Marvin out of the house if he misbehaved. In 1956, when Marvin Gaye was 17 years old, he dropped out of high school and enlisted in the United States Air Force. Instead of working on jet airplanes as he had hoped, he performed menial labor instead. After just 8 months on duty in 1957, Marvin faked mental illness and was given a general discharge from the United States Air Force. After Marvin was discharged, he, along with a good friend named Reese Palmer, formed a quartet called the Marquis. The group would perform locally in Washington, D.C., and the group would eventually begin working with Bo Diddley. They temporarily signed a label with OK Records, and the Marquis released their one and only single, White Arp, but the single failed to chart and they were dropped from the label shortly after. The Marquis later changed their name to Moonglows under Harvey Fuqua's direction, and they recorded several songs in 1959. The group later disbanded in 1960, and Marvin Gaye relocated to Detroit with Harvey Fuqua, and he signed with Tri-Fi Records as a session musician, playing the drums on several of Tri-Fi's releases. In December of 1960, Marvin performed at Motown's president Berry Gordy's house. Berry Gordy was very impressed with Marvin's talent and negotiated with Harry Fuqua to allow Marvin to sign with Motown's Tamla. After officially signing with Tamla, Marvin Gaye pursued a career as a performer of jazz music, and right before he released his first single, Let Your Conscience Be Your Guide, in May of 1961, he began spelling his last name, which originally was G-A-Y, and he added an E on the end, which is the official spelling of Marvin Gaye that we all know him by. According to author David Ritz, Marvin did this to silence all of the rumors that he was gay and to also distance himself further from his father, MG Sr. Marvin's initial recordings failed commercially, and he struggled most of the year of 1961. He continued to perform session work as a drummer for artists such as The Miracles and The Marvelettes. In 1962, Marvin Gaye finally got a taste of success for his solo, Stubborn Kinda Fellow. It reached number 8 on the R&B chart and number 46 on the Billboard's Hot 100. As more singles were being released, the more attention Marvin Gaye was beginning to receive. His brilliant singing voice and 4-octave vocal range was starting to reach millions, and no one could get enough of him. In October of 1963, the live album that was called Marvin Gaye Recorded Live on Stage was released, with the song Can I Get a Witness, becoming one of Marvin Gaye's first early international successes. Also in 1963, Marvin married Anna Gordy, and if the last name Gordy sounded familiar, that's because it is. She was the sister of Motown's president, Berry Gordy. His marriage to Anna Gordy only solidified his contract with Motown. With Marvin's success growing, he was able to purchase a home in an upper-middle-class neighborhood in Washington, D.C., and moved his parents, Alberta and MG Sr., out of the projects and into this home, but Marvin still refused to be in the same room as his father. Although in 1968, he would extend an olive branch to his father by purchasing and giving MG Sr. a Cadillac as a present, which, according to Marvin, this gift had little effect in regards to their bitter relationship. In 1964, Marvin began recording duets with multiple iconic female singers. He made an entire album called Together with Mary Wells. He sang the song It Takes Two with Kim Weston, and most notably, he worked with rising star Tammy Terrell. I mean, who could ever forget Ain't No Mountain High Enough? 100% a very iconic song. Marvin and Tammy made beautiful songs together that still play everywhere to this day. Tammy Terrell did not get to enjoy her stardom for very long. In fact, she has a pretty sad story as well. Tammy Terrell had been involved in multiple abusive relationships, starting with James Brown when she was just 17 years old. He had beat her several times during their relationship. She eventually broke it off with James Brown, but then she started another abusive relationship with the Temptations lead singer, David Ruffin, whose drug addiction at the time led to violent arguments. Their relationship ended in 1967 after David Ruffin hit her over the head with his motorcycle helmet. As a young, beautiful, and beyond talented woman, she was treated like shit by these entitled male artists beating her. Marvin Gaye and Tammy Terrell became incredibly close during their years recording and singing together. In October of 1967, Marvin and Tammy were performing at Camden-Cindy College located just outside of Farmville, Virginia. During their performance of the song Your Precious Love, Tammy had collapsed in Marvin's arms. She was taken to the hospital and the doctors diagnosed her with a malignant tumor on the right side of her brain. She would undergo multiple brain surgeries for the next 3 years, but her health continued to decline. In late 1969, she made her final public appearance at the Apollo Theater where Marvin Gaye was performing. He actually spotted Tammy, helped her on stage, and then they performed the song You're All I Need to Get By. It was their last performance together. After the song was over, they were given a standing ovation. By early 1970, Tammy's health had worsened even more. She was using a wheelchair, she experienced blindness, hair loss, and she only weighed 93 pounds. One final operation was performed on Tammy on January 21, 1970, but Tammy Terrell went into a coma and she passed away on March 16, 1970 from brain cancer at the age of just 24 years old. Tammy's mother Jenny prohibited everyone from Motown's industry from attending her funeral except for Marvin Gaye. Her mother blamed almost everyone from the label for failing to protect Tammy from David Ruffin's violent abuse. She allowed Marvin to attend her daughter's funeral as she believed Marvin was her closest friend, and he actually read a eulogy at Tammy Terrell's funeral. Marvin never got over the death of his dear friend. Shortly after Tammy's death, Marvin Gaye went into a downward spiral of depression and drug abuse. True fans of Marvin Gaye all noticed a significant difference in his music after the death of Tammy Terrell. In 1971, Marvin convinced Motown to release the album What's Going On, which was drastically different from his previous work. Instead of soul music, this album incorporated jazz and funk and explored political issues. Marvin actually refused to release any other new material he was working on at the time until the label released the What's Going On album. They eventually agreed to release it, and this album skyrocketed across R&B charts. It reached #1 within a couple of weeks after its release, and it remained #1 for 5 entire weeks. It was an incredible success. It sold over 2 million copies, and Rolling Stone magazine ranked the album as the best album of all time. With all of this success, Marvin Gaye was able to gain more creative control over his music. It was also around this time that Marvin Gaye and MG Sr. did reconcile briefly following the success of What's Going On. And this was a pretty big step for father and son, because like I said, for years, Marvin would refuse to be in the same room as MG Sr. In 1973, the Let's Get It On album was released, and Marvin's dependency for cocaine was getting worse. Marvin and Anna Gordy separated the same year as well. During this relationship, Anna Gordy's niece Denise Gordy fell pregnant at 15 years old and gave birth to a baby boy in 1965. Anna faked a pregnancy with Marvin Gaye at the time, and they actually adopted the baby boy and named him Marvin Gaye III. Marvin Gaye has always been suspected as being this child's biological father, but to this day, this has never been confirmed. Anna Gordy was significantly older than Marvin Gaye, and he was known to have affairs with younger women. One of these women would be Janice Hunter, who would eventually become Marvin Gaye's second wife. They met in 1973. Janice was only 17 years old, and Marvin was 34 years old, which don't even get me started on. The success of the song Let's Get It On was overwhelming. Marvin Gaye's career was almost at its peak, but his demons were getting the best of him. As his fame grew, his dependency on drugs grew along with it. He had 2 children with Janice, a daughter, Nona, in 1974, and a son, Frankie, in 1975. He married Janice officially in 1977, but this relationship wasn't always a happy one. Sometime in 1976, Marvin started to run out of money, mainly due to his expensive drug habits, alimony payments to his first wife, Anna, and owing a lot of money to the IRS. His relationship with his second wife, Janice, was also becoming quite toxic. Both Marvin and Janice would spend a lot of time getting high together, with Marvin's choice of drug, cocaine. Marvin would also coerce Janice into having sex with other men and couples as he watched. The pair would frequently cheat on each other. Marvin spent most of his time high, and while on drugs, he was becoming an extremely paranoid and violent person himself. Janice claims one day after getting high on a blend of psychedelic mushrooms and cocaine, Marvin and Janice started to discuss some of Janice's affairs with other men, and Marvin became enraged with jealousy. He took a kitchen knife and put it to Janice's throat. He regained control of himself before he was able to physically harm her, but Janice was not taking any more chances. She took their kids, Nona and Frankie, and left Marvin after 2 years of marriage in 1979, and officially divorced him in 1981. In December of 1978, Marvin released the album Here My Dear, that was heavily inspired by the failure of his first marriage with Anna, but this album performed poorly in the charts. In 1980, Marvin Gaye went on a European tour, and after the tour was over, he relocated to London as he feared that he would be imprisoned if he returned to the United States for failure to pay back taxes. The amount of back taxes he owed was $4.5 million, which would be approximately $15 million today. Paranoia was setting in on Marvin, and he continued to intensify his drug use during this period. In late 1980, Marvin Gaye would have a falling out with Motown Records after someone stole a rough draft album from one of Marvin's traveling musicians, and Motown remixed this album and released it without this musician's consent. After this incident, Marvin had vowed not to record any more music for Motown. In 1981, Marvin relocated to Ostend, Belgium. It was here in Belgium for the first time in years that Marvin Gaye would temporarily stop his constant cocaine drug use. He began exercising regularly and started attending church again. After several months of recovery, Marvin announced his plan to make a comeback in the music industry, and this time it would be without Motown. With the help of Columbia Records, they buy out the remainder of Marvin's contract with Motown, and immediately Marvin Gaye starts to work on his first post-Motown album titled Midnight Love, with the first single being Sexual Healing. Marvin recorded this entire album while still living in Belgium. Following the release of the song Sexual Healing in September of 1982, it became a worldwide success, spending a record 10 weeks at #1 and became the biggest R&B hit in the 1980s. Sexual Healing won Marvin's first 2 Grammy Awards, with People magazine calling it America's hottest musical turn-on since Olivia Newton-John's song Physical. When the rest of the album Midnight Love was released about a month later, it was just as successful, peaking at the top 10 of the Billboard 200 and eventually selling 3 million albums in the US alone, which is beyond impressive during this time in the 80s. In April of 1983, Marvin Gaye would return to the U.S. for what would be his last concert tour that was titled the Sexual Healing Tour. But as it always had been for Marvin, once he tasted the success, he became his own worst enemy, and he fell right back into his cocaine drug addiction while on this tour. His cocaine abuse escalated, and Marvin became overwhelmingly paranoid, fearing and believing that someone was trying to kill him. Towards the middle of the tour, Marvin hired several bodyguards with loaded guns and began wearing bulletproof vests while performing on stage. He was truly convinced that someone was trying to kill him. He hired a lawyer to investigate an incident where he drank out of a bottle of water that he believed had been poisoned. And from that point forward, he would only drink bottles of water that was brought to him from his sister. Marvin Gaye was spiraling into a deep depression and would unsuccessfully attempt to take his own life while on this tour. And this wasn't the first time he had attempted suicide. He had attempted suicide a few times throughout his adult life. It's safe to say that Marvin Gaye was a wreck. The persistent paranoia of being killed while on this tour took a very heavy toll on Marvin. By the end of the tour in August, Marvin was absolutely exhausted. Every single city he visited, he had it in his head that it would be his last. Marvin was then hospitalized for exhaustion when the tour finally ended. Soon after Marvin was released from the hospital, he actually moved back in with his parents at 2101 South Gramercy Place in Los Angeles, California, that he had purchased for them in 1973. He initially moved back in with his parents to help his mother, Alberta, who was recovering from kidney surgery. MG Sr. was absent from the home when Marvin Gaye first arrived. It wasn't until October that MG Sr. returned from a business trip in Washington, D.C. As soon as MG Sr. came back, the two men continuously butt heads with each other. Alberta and MG Sr.'s marriage had been estranged for about a decade at this point. They hadn't even slept in the same bed together since moving into this house in 1973. MG Sr. drank liquor every single day, while Marvin Gaye was using cocaine every single day. The both of them tried to ignore each other while living in this house together, but there were several violent altercations between father and son. Marvin would isolate himself in his room, too paranoid to even leave the house without being high. Alberta would later describe the state of her son during these months, and she would tearfully describe how Marvin Gaye would spend days not leaving his room, and that the only person Marvin saw for weeks was his drug dealer dropping off another supply of cocaine for him. Alberta would catch her son using cocaine on multiple occasions, each time with Marvin Gaye pleading with his mother and promising her that this would be the last time. But it never was. Eventually, Marvin would open his door to multiple women. He would have sexual relationship with these women who would constantly come in and out of the home. Marvin was still in a very paranoid state of mind, as on Christmas of 1983, he gave his father a Smith & Wesson .38 special pistol, so according to Marvin, that he could protect himself from intruders. For 6 whole months, the toxicity between father and son never swayed. Anytime MG Sr. would yell and scream at Alberta for anything, Marvin would step in and defend his mother, telling MG Sr. to leave her alone. I couldn't imagine being someone living in this house. Both men were ticking time bombs ready to explode. At one point, MG Sr. actually called the police to have his son leave the property. When Marvin left, he stayed with one of his sisters for a few days, but then came back into the home, and when a friend asked Marvin why he continued to live in this house, he stated, quote, "After all, I have just one father. I want to make peace with him," end quote. This peace with his father never came. Millions of people adored Marvin as a musician, but MG Sr. allegedly resented his son's success. Multiple witnesses and family members have concluded that MG Sr. had never once been proud of his son. There was just something about Marvin that MG Sr. despised. He told his children several times throughout their lives, quote, "I brought you into this world. I can take you out," close quote. And unfortunately, he wasn't lying. According to Marvin's older sister Jean, just 4 days before her brother's death, Marvin would attempt suicide one final time. He jumped out of a speeding sports car at 60 miles per hour, and after jumping out of this car, he got up and walked away with only minimal bruising. On March 31st, 1984, MG Sr. had become increasingly upset throughout the day. He was pissed because he couldn't find an insurance policy letter, and he was adamant that Alberta had misplaced this document. MG Sr. was frantically searching the entire house for this insurance policy, and as more and more time went by, the more angry he was getting at Alberta, blaming her, and her alone for the missing document. By the end of the night, Marvin had had enough of his father yelling at his mother, and while they were all in Marvin's room, Marvin demanded MG Sr. to leave Alberta alone. Reluctantly, MG Sr. backed off from Alberta, but he continued to angrily storm through the house, still looking for the insurance policy, until finally going to bed. The next morning, April 1st, 1984, the tension in the house was still very high. MG Sr. was still beyond angry the entire morning. At around 12:30 p.m., Alberta was in Marvin's bedroom. Both of them were talking, and MG Sr. yelled from downstairs once again, screaming at Alberta about the missing insurance policy. Marvin came out from the bedroom in his robe and yelled at MG Sr. from the upstairs railing and told his father that if he wanted to speak to his mother, then he can come upstairs and speak to her in person. MG Sr. became even more overheated by this response, and he charged up the stairs into Marvin's bedroom. Alberta was sitting on Marvin's bed while Marvin was laying down in his bed. As soon as MG Sr. came into the room, he immediately screamed at Alberta for the missing document, and Marvin sprung out of the bed and he demanded his father to leave the room once again. But this time, MG Sr. held his ground, and he refused to leave the room, still screaming at Alberta. That's when Marvin physically pushed and shoved MG Sr. out of the room. MG Sr. fell to the floor in the hallway, and Marvin began kicking and punching him while he was on the ground. MG Sr. was able to get up and was trying to get to his bedroom, but Marvin was still kicking at him, until Alberta finally got in between the two men and was able to stop the altercation. As soon as Marvin stopped hitting and kicking his father, MG Sr. calmly got up and walked into his own bedroom. Minutes later, at approximately 12:38 p.m., MG Sr. re-entered Marvin's room with the .38 pistol his son had bought for him on Christmas, and without saying a single word, he pointed it directly at Marvin, who was sitting on his bed, and he shot him directly in the chest. The shot to the chest was fatal. It entered the right side of Marvin's chest, hitting his lung, heart, diaphragm, liver, stomach, and left kidney. It ricocheted through his body, the bullet coming to a rest against his left flank. Marvin immediately fell to the floor. His mother, Alberta, who was standing about 8 feet away from her son, could only scream after he had been shot by his own father. MG Sr., who was still incredibly calm, stepped closer to Marvin, who was now on the floor, slumped against his bed, and shot him a second time at point-blank range to his left shoulder, just below the clavicle. The second bullet exited out of his shoulder. And if there was anything I question about this case, is why MG Sr. shot Marvin in this location at all. I'm honestly not sure if he did this just to cause Marvin more pain as he died or what. But after shooting him in the chest on the first shot, it just seems pretty bizarre to me that he would take the time to walk toward Marvin and decide to shoot him at point-blank range at his shoulder. But I don't know, maybe that's just me. Alberta fled the room after MG Sr. fired the second shot. She ran outside and was greeted by her younger son Frankie and his wife Irene. They lived in the guest house right next door, and they had heard the shots. At first, Frankie thought the first gunshot had been a car's backfire, but after the second shot and hearing his mother screaming, that's when they came outside to see what was going on. Alberta was screaming, telling Frankie that MG Sr. had shot Marvin. Irene called 911 while Frankie bravely ran into the house with no hesitation whatsoever. He didn't know if MG Sr. was still armed. He didn't know if his brother was even still alive. But he ran into his brother's bedroom and was met with a horrific sight. His brother Marvin was bleeding out on the floor. Frankie pulled Marvin into his lap, and according to Frankie himself in his 2003 book titled Marvin Gaye, My Brother, allegedly while Marvin was in his arms, barely speaking above a whisper, told him, quote, "I got what I wanted. I couldn't do it myself, so I had him do it. It's good. I ran my race. There's no more left in me." End quote. As Marvin Gaye was bleeding out in his brother's arms, MG Sr. walked back into his own room, hid the gun underneath his pillow. Then he went outside and sat on the porch, waiting for the police to arrive. After paramedics arrived, they refused to enter the house until they were able to see the gun. Irene then entered the house and searched for the gun in MG Sr.'s bedroom. After searching frantically for a couple of minutes, she finally found it underneath his pillow and dropped it outside on the front lawn. Marvin Gaye was taken to the California Hospital Medical Center, where he was pronounced dead on arrival at 1:01 p.m. on April 1st, 1984, just one day shy of his 45th birthday. An autopsy was performed on Marvin shortly after his death. He had traces of cocaine and PCP found in his system. The autopsy concluded that the first initial gunshot wound was indeed the fatal shot. MG Sr. was immediately arrested for first-degree murder and held at the Los Angeles County Jail on $100,000 bail. During his interview with police, MG Sr. claimed that he had been scared of his son and that he only meant to shoot in self-defense, and that he didn't know that the gun actually had bullets in it. Whatever, dude. He was asked by investigators if he loved his son, and MG Sr. reportedly responded to this by stating, quote, "Let's say I didn't dislike him," end quote. Which, that is such a weird answer to that question, and honestly, that answer is all I needed to read to draw my own conclusions about how MG Sr. truly felt about his son. MG Sr. was adamant that he didn't mean to kill his son, which was printed all over the newspaper. At first, the general public thought the news reporting that Marvin Gaye had been killed was all just some sick April Fool's joke. But as more information came out, people began to realize it wasn't a joke, and they were heartbroken. Marvin Gaye's siblings believed that their brother's death was a premeditated suicide. His older sister Jean would go on to say that Marvin Gaye accomplished 3 things by driving MG Sr. to kill him. 1. He put himself out of his misery. 2. He brought relief to their mother Alberta by finally getting her husband out of her life. And 3. He finally got to punish his father for the abuse he inflicted on him his entire life by making certain that the rest of his life would be miserable. Thousands of fans came and stood outside the house he had been killed in, and they held vigils outside his home. On April 5th, 1984, Marvin Gaye's funeral was held, with 10,000 people attending his funeral. Many accomplished musicians have been at attendance, including Smokey Robinson and Stevie Wonder. At his family's request, his body was cremated after the funeral, with half of his ashes spread near the Pacific Ocean by his 3 children and his first wife, Anna. Anna and their son Marvin III kept a small portion of Marvin Gaye's ashes for themselves. With Marvin Gaye leaving behind no will, Marvin III, at just 17 years old, became co-administrator of his estate. Marvin Gaye was still millions of dollars in debt when he had been killed, but royalties from his work would eventually pay off all of these debts. MG Sr.'s $100,000 bail was eventually reduced to $30,000, and his wife Alberta was actually the one who posted his bond for him. After a few weeks had passed, it was noticed that MG Sr.'s health was rapidly declining, and in May of 1984, doctors discovered a benign, walnut-sized brain tumor in his pituitary gland, which, unsurprisingly, the defense used this tumor as a factor to consider during the preliminary hearings of this trial for the murder of Marvin Gaye. The judge very quickly ruled that MG Sr. was competent to stand trial and that he was fully aware of what he had done to his son. After the results of Marvin Gaye's autopsy showed that he had cocaine and PCP in his system when he had died, and the photos of the injuries that MG Sr. had received from his son punching and kicking him were shown, Judge Gordon Ringer agreed to let MG Sr. enter a plea bargain. MG Sr. pleaded no contest to a charge of voluntary manslaughter on September 20th, 1984. During his sentencing hearing on November 20th, 1984, MG Sr. stated, quote, "If I could bring him back, I would. I was afraid of him. I thought I was going to get hurt. I didn't know what was going to happen. I'm really sorry for everything that happened. I loved him. I wish he could step through this door right now. I'm paying the price now." End quote. MG Sr. was given a 6-year suspended sentence and 5 years of probation for the murder of his son, Marvin Gaye. Alberta finally got the courage to file for divorce from MG Sr. after 49 years of marriage, but eventually settled for just separation. After the hearing, MG Sr. returned to the home where he had murdered his son, and he actually lived there for a while. He did spend the remaining years of his life alone. He eventually ended up in a nursing home in Culver City, California, and he died of pneumonia on October 10th, 1998. I've concluded during my research for this case that a lot of people believe that MG Sr. had gotten away with murdering Marvin Gaye. Most people believe he should have received prison time for shooting his son twice and killing him with the very gun he had bought for him for Christmas. But after doing my research, learning everything that had happened during Marvin Gaye's life and career, I gotta say I'm very torn about this case. I don't know what the right sentence should have been for MG Sr. By all accounts of Marvin Gaye's family, they all truly believe that Marvin Gaye made the decision to get his father angry enough to kill him. His last words, according to his brother, if what he says is true, confirms that. MG Sr. never cared about his son Marvin Gaye. In my opinion, he was jealous and resentful of his son's success. He wanted to treat Marvin like shit, and he wanted Alberta to treat him like shit. Even if Marvin provoked his father on purpose so he would kill him, that doesn't mean MG Sr. should have been able to walk free. He still purposely murdered his own son. In my heart, I do think he should have received a prison sentence instead of a suspended sentence and a few years of probation. I say this all the time. If a person is willing to murder their own flesh and blood, then they are willing to kill anyone, and that's terrifying. Marvin Gaye, the icon that he was, suffered a lot during his life. His talent touches the hearts of millions to this very day. He had his demons, and he wasn't perfect by any means. He made a lot of mistakes, including abuse, just like his father had inflicted on him. Both of these men needed professional help. All of the drugs Marvin took ruined him. It's horrible that he never got past his own demons, and that toward the end of his life, he had been in a constant state of paranoia. Even though Marvin Gaye's life was taken from him by the hands of his own father, his music and his mark on the world will continue to live on. But that is all I have for today's case. As always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you liked this video. Let me know what your opinions are about this case down below, and I'll catch you guys next time for case number 20. But until then, bye guys.